America's first murder. A New World Without Law, 1638. The year was 1638. America did not yet exist. There was no constitution, no police force, no prisons, no rules that truly bound men together. Only land, fear, and survival. The colonies were fragile outposts clinging to an unforgiving wilderness. Every sunrise was a victory. Every sunset carried the threat that someone might not live to see morning again. These were people who had crossed an ocean not for comfort, but for belief. They carried God in their hearts and violence at their doorsteps. In this world, life was cheap, but murder was unthinkable. Because murder meant something worse than death. It meant the collapse of order itself. The settlers believed they were chosen. A new Israel in a promised land. They believed that God watched every step, every word, every secret thought. And yet, beneath their prayers and sermons, something darker was growing. A crime that would change everything. A colony on the edge. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was not a town. It was an experiment. Men and women lived in crude wooden homes, surrounded by forests that seemed endless. Wolves howled at night. Native tribes watched from the shadows. Hunger was constant. Disease was common. Survival was never guaranteed. There was no privacy. Everyone knew everyone. A man's reputation was his currency. One accusation could destroy a family forever. And yet, trust was absolute. Because without trust, the colony could not survive. This is what made the crime so terrifying. The killer was not an outsider. Not a savage from the forest. Not a criminal from England. He was one of them. The man no one feared. His name was John Billington. He was not rich. He was not powerful. He was not particularly respected. But he was familiar. Billington had arrived in the New World years earlier. A restless man with a history of defiance. Even before this moment, he had clashed with authority. He argued. He disobeyed orders. He carried anger like a second skin. Still, no one believed he was capable of murder. In a place where survival required cooperation, Billington blended in. He worked. He prayed. He spoke when spoken to. And that made him invisible. A world without justice. Here is something modern listeners struggle to understand. In 1638, there was no legal blueprint for murder. English law existed, but it was distant and incomplete. Trials were improvised. Punishments were decided by men who had never faced such a crime before. There was no precedent. If someone committed murder in this new world, the colony would have to invent justice from scratch. And that terrified them, because how they handled this crime would decide whether their society could survive or fall apart. The victim. The victim was John Newcomen, a respected member of the colony. He was not a troublemaker. He was not violent. He was not hated, which made his death even more disturbing. Newcomen had gone missing quietly. No alarms, no panic. People assumed he was working, hunting, or traveling, until his body was found. The discovery. It happened near a muddy path, not far from the settlement. A body. Cold. Still. Broken. The wound was unmistakable. This was no accident. No animal attack. This was murder. And with that discovery, something fundamental broke. Because for the first time, the colonists realized a horrifying truth. The greatest danger was not the wilderness. It was each other. Panic without words. News spread fast. Faster than fire. Doors were locked. Voices lowered. People watched one another differently. A glance lasted too long. A silence felt suspicious. If murder was possible here, then no one was safe. The leaders of the colony gathered in secret. They prayed. They argued. They feared not just the crime, but the consequences. Because if they failed to respond correctly, God's favor might leave them. And if they responded too harshly, fear would rule the colony. This was more than a crime. This was a test. The first question, who could have done this? There were no investigators, no evidence collection, no forensic science, only testimonies, only rumors, only faith. And slowly, quietly, one name began to surface. John Billington. Not because he was seen, not because there was proof, but because people remembered his temper. And in a world built on trust, memory was enough to destroy a man. A dangerous accusation. Accusing someone of murder in 1638 was explosive. Once a man was suspected, his life was effectively over. Even innocence could not restore what suspicion destroyed. Still, the whispers grew louder. Billington had argued with Newcomen. Billington had been seen nearby. Billington had a history of defiance. Circumstantial, incomplete, but terrifying. And yet, the colony hesitated, because to accuse him formally meant something irreversible. It meant the birth of American justice, the body in the mud. When fear learned a name, the body did not announce itself. It waited, lying half-sunken in damp earth, where the ground gave way to standing water, where boots sank and pulled free with a sound like breathing. The place was ordinary, a narrow path, used often, trusted by everyone. That was what made it unbearable. John Newcomen was found face down, his coat dark with mud, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. His hat lay several feet away, as if it had been knocked loose in a struggle that no one heard and no one came to stop. There was no blood pooling dramatically, no scene that demanded attention, just silence. And silence in a colony like this was terrifying. The first witness, the man who found the body, did not scream. He froze. That detail would be remembered later, repeated quietly in homes and whispered during prayer. A scream would have been human. A scream would have released fear. Instead, the man stood still, staring down at something that should not exist. A murdered body. When he finally turned back toward the settlement, his legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself wanted to keep him there. He would later say that the forest felt closer that day, like it had leaned in to watch. By the time he reached the first house, his voice shook so badly that his words came out broken. "There's a man," he said. "God help us, there's a man." Recognition. They did not need long to identify him. That alone changed everything. John Newcomen was known. He had eaten at their tables, prayed beside them, worked with them. He was not anonymous. He was not distant. He belonged. Someone lifted his face carefully, as if he might still feel pain. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Mud clung to his beard. His lips were pale. A woman covered her mouth and turned away. Another whispered a prayer without realizing she was doing it. This was not death by sickness, not hunger, not the wilderness claiming another soul. This was violence, deliberate, personal. The wound. No one spoke about the wound at first. They didn't have the words. There was a deep injury to his chest, made by a blade or a sharp tool. Not clumsy, not wild. It was placed with intention. Whoever did this had stood close. Close enough to hear breath. Close enough to see fear. That realization spread faster than any rumor. This was not a crime committed in panic. It was a choice. The gathering crowd. The settlement moved as one body. People came running, then slowed as they reached the edge of the scene. No one wanted to step too close. Children were pulled back roughly. Doors were shut. Curtains drawn. Someone said, "Don't touch anything." Even though no one knew why that mattered, the leaders arrived last. Their faces told the truth before they spoke. This was beyond anything they had prepared for. They stood over the body not as judges, but as men suddenly aware that their authority rested on fragile ground. Because now they had a question no sermon had ever answered. What do you do when one of your own commits murder? No place to put the dead. There was an immediate problem no one had anticipated. Where do you put the body? There was no morgue, no procedure, no official act to follow. Moving him felt wrong. Leaving him felt worse. In the end, they covered Newcomen with a blanket and assigned 2 men to stand watch, as if guarding him might somehow undo what had already happened. That night, no one slept easily. The colony felt smaller. Fear takes shape. Fear does not arrive all at once. It creeps. A neighbor's voice sounds unfamiliar. A glance lingers too long. A memory replays differently. People began to ask themselves questions they had never needed to ask before. Who was angry yesterday? Who argued with Newcomen? Who left early? Who returned late? And beneath those questions, a deeper one formed. If this could happen once, why not again? Whispers become patterns. By morning, the whispers had direction. John Billington's name did not explode into conversation. It slipped in quietly. Someone remembered an argument. Someone else remembered harsh words spoken weeks ago. Another remembered Billington's temper. None of it was proof. All of it felt dangerous. Billington had always been different. Not lawless, but resistant. He challenged authority in ways others did not dare to. In a peaceful colony, that was irritating. In a shaken one, it was suspicious. The leader's dilemma. The colony's magistrates met behind closed doors. They prayed first, long and hard. Then they argued. Some said they must act quickly, to show strength. Others warned that a false accusation would destroy the colony from within. They knew something no one else fully understood yet. This was not just about finding a killer. This was about control. If fear spread unchecked, trust would collapse. And without trust, the colony would fail. But if they accused the wrong man, justice itself would lose meaning before it even existed. No rules to follow. There was no guide for this moment. English law was a distant memory, filtered through religion and necessity. There were no written procedures for investigating murder in a place that was barely holding together. Everything they did would set precedent. How they questioned, who they accused, how they punished. This crime was forcing them to invent a system, and systems once created never truly disappear. Billington learns the rumors. John Billington heard the whispers before anyone spoke to him directly. That too would matter later. He noticed the looks, the silence when he entered a room, the way conversation stopped. At first he dismissed it, then he didn't. Billington was many things, but he was not stupid. He knew how quickly a reputation could turn, and he knew something else. In a world ruled by faith, suspicion could be as deadly as guilt. The first questioning, when the leaders finally called him in, it was not an arrest. Not yet. They spoke calmly, asked where he had been, who he had seen, what he remembered of the day Newcomen disappeared. Billington answered, sometimes clearly, sometimes defensively. That alone raised concern. Innocent men, they believed, had nothing to defend. But that belief would later prove dangerously flawed. Contradictions, small inconsistencies appeared. Nothing dramatic, a time that didn't align, a place that couldn't be confirmed. In modern eyes, these would mean little. In 1638, they felt enormous. Because when evidence is scarce, every detail becomes heavy with meaning. The leaders exchanged glances. Not accusation, not certainty, concern. A colony watching. By now, everyone knew something was happening. They didn't know details, but they felt the tension, like a storm building without rain. Children were kept close. Tools were locked away. Men stayed awake later than usual. The idea that someone among them had crossed a line so severe it threatened God's favor weighed heavily. This was not just murder. This was sin made visible. The weight of belief. Religion did not soften the moment. It sharpened it. They believed God punished communities, not just individuals. A single unaddressed sin could bring famine, disease, or destruction. Doing nothing was not an option. Justice was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. The decision? Late one night, the leaders reached a conclusion. They would move forward. John Billington would be formally accused, not because they were certain, but because uncertainty itself had become dangerous. The accusation would force the truth to surface, one way or another. And in doing so, they would take a step no American society had ever taken before. They would put one of their own on trial for murder. The quiet before history. Billington was informed at dawn. No shouting, no chains, no spectacle. Just words spoken carefully, heavily. He listened without interruption. Then he said something that would be remembered long after his death. This will not end as you think. Whether it was a warning, a threat, or a desperate statement of innocence, no one could say. But everyone felt it. A community turns inward. When faith became evidence, by the time the accusation became public, the colony had already changed. Nothing looked different. The same wooden houses, the same narrow paths, the same bells calling people to prayer. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Trust had cracked. People still greeted each other, but their eyes searched faces a little longer. Words were chosen more carefully. Silence carried meaning. A man had been accused of murder, and everyone understood what that meant. This was no longer about John Billington alone. It was about all of them. The sound of judgment. There was no courthouse. When the colony gathered, they did so in a meeting house that served every purpose, worship, decisions, punishment, community. The space smelled of wood and damp wool. Light filtered through small windows, dull and uneven. Men sat stiffly. Women were placed apart. Children were warned to stay quiet. John Billington was brought in without chains. That detail mattered. Chains would have meant guilt. Their absence meant something far more dangerous. Possibility. The weight of being watched. Billington felt it immediately. Every eye on him carried its own story. Some remembered his past arguments. Others remembered kindness. A few remembered nothing at all, which was worse. To be unknown in this moment was to be empty of defense. He stood straight. Too straight, some would later say. Confidence looked suspicious now. No presumption of innocence. In the modern world, innocence is assumed until proven otherwise. In 1638, that idea did not exist. The question was not whether Billington was innocent. The question was whether God would reveal his guilt. This distinction shaped everything that followed. Because if God was believed to guide the process, then doubt itself became sinful. Testimony as truth. There were no investigators. Instead, there were testimonies. One man spoke of an argument he had overheard weeks earlier. He could not recall the words exactly, but remembered the tone. Harsh. Angry. Another said Billington had spoken ill of Newcomen. Not threats. Just resentment. A third remembered seeing Billington walking alone on the day Newcomen disappeared. Each testimony on its own meant little. Together they formed something dangerous. A pattern. Memory under pressure. What no one said aloud was that memory changes when fear enters the room. People remembered differently now. Sharper. more dramatic. Moments that once felt insignificant gained weight. An argument became a warning. A complaint became a motive. Silence became concealment. And because everyone believed God punished communities for hidden sin, no one wanted to be the one who stayed silent. Silence felt like complicity. Billington speaks. When Billington was allowed to respond, the room leaned forward. He denied killing Newcomen, not dramatically, not emotionally, firmly. He explained his movements, corrected details, questioned why rumors mattered more than facts. That was his mistake. In this world, questioning the process looked like defying God's will. Calm felt cold. Logic felt evasive. Some nodded. Others frowned. Faith did not like being challenged. Religion enters the trial. Scripture was quoted, not to prove guilt, but to frame it. Verses about hidden sin, about anger in the heart, about blood crying out from the ground. The implication was clear. Even if no one had seen the act, God had. And God, they believed, would not allow an innocent man to be accused without reason. This belief closed doors quietly. Once accepted, it made alternative explanations feel unnecessary. The problem of evidence. There was no weapon presented, no witness to the act, no confession. What they had was character. And in 1638, character mattered more than proof. Billington's past defiance was re-examined not as behavior, but as destiny. This is who he had always been, they said. Which was another way of saying, this is who we believe he must be. The role of fear. Fear sat beside every speaker. Fear of being wrong. Fear of angering God. Fear of letting a murderer walk free. But above all, fear of what would happen if justice failed. Because failure would mean admitting they were not prepared for the world they were building. That possibility was unbearable. A community divides. Quiet divisions formed. Some believed Billington was being judged too quickly. They spoke softly, if at all. Others believed hesitation itself was dangerous. They spoke louder. Families whispered at night. Friendships cooled. This was the first time the colony had turned inward like this. Not against nature. Not against outsiders. Against itself. The unspoken question. No one asked it directly, but everyone felt it. What if he is innocent? That thought passed through minds and was quickly pushed away. Because if he was innocent, then what they were doing was worse than murder. It was injustice. And injustice carried consequences no one wanted to face. The turning point. A witness stepped forward who claimed Billington had admitted anger strong enough to wish Newcomen harm. Not a confession, not a threat, a feeling. In modern terms, it would mean nothing. Here, it meant everything. Anger was seen as the seed of violence. And seeds once planted were assumed to grow. The room shifted. This was enough. Billington understands. For the first time, Billington's composure broke. He realized something fundamental. This was no longer a search for truth. It was a process moving toward an outcome already decided. He spoke again. Stronger now, more urgent. He said they were mistaking memory for fact. Faith for certainty. But the room was no longer listening. Judgment before verdict. Though no sentence had been passed, Billington's fate had narrowed. People spoke of him in the past tense. As a lesson, as a warning. The idea of mercy faded quietly. Because mercy, they believed, invited disorder. And disorder was the enemy. Night falls on the colony. That evening, the settlement was unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no songs. Only doors closing. Some prayed for justice. Others prayed for forgiveness. A few prayed for Billington. And one man sat alone, realizing that history had already begun writing his name. The trial with no rules. When judgment came before law, the trial did not begin with order. It began with uncertainty. There was no formal announcement, no clear opening, no statement of charges read aloud in a structured way. What happened instead felt more like a gathering pulled forward by gravity than a court, assembled by design. Men who had never judged another life now found themselves responsible for doing exactly that. They took their seats knowing something uncomfortable. Whatever they decided would become law, not just for this case, but for everyone that followed. A court that didn't exist yet. There were no lawyers, no defense counsel, no prosecutor, no rules of objection. The magistrates acted as everything at once. Investigators, judges, interpreters of God's will. They believed this was not a flaw. They believed this was purity. Law to them was not meant to be clever. It was meant to be righteous. And righteousness, they believed, came from certainty, not debate. Billington stands alone. John Billington stood before them with nothing but his words. No advocate, no structure to protect him, no concept of rights as we understand them today. He was allowed to speak, but only within the space they permitted. Every answer he gave was filtered through suspicion. Every clarification was treated as deflection. In this room, silence was guilt and speech was danger. There was no safe ground. The question of intent. The magistrates focused less on what had happened and more on why it might have happened. Intent mattered deeply to them. Had Billington harbored anger? Had he spoken ill of the victim? Had he resisted authority before? These questions were repeated in different forms, not to gather information, but to shape a narrative. A man who resisted order, they believed, could resist life itself. Faith as a framework. Each pause was filled with scripture, not read ceremoniously, but referenced casually, as if it were a shared language everyone already understood. Verses about Cain and Abel, verses about blood crying out to heaven, verses about hidden sin revealed by God. These references carried weight far heavier than testimony, because scripture did not need proof. It only needed belief, the absence of doubt. No one argued for reasonable doubt. The concept did not exist. Instead, doubt itself was viewed with suspicion. If God allowed this accusation to rise, they believed, then God must have intended it. To question the process was to question divine order. This belief closed the door on alternatives. Quietly and completely, witnesses revisited. Witnesses were called again, not to be challenged, but to be reinforced. Stories were repeated. Details grew sharper. Confidence replaced uncertainty. No one asked whether memories had changed since the first telling. No one asked whether fear had colored perception. Consistency, not accuracy, became the goal, and consistency was achieved. Billington's defense weakens. Billington tried to adapt. He spoke less forcefully, chose his words more carefully, but the damage was already done. His earlier resistance had marked him. His reputation now spoke louder than his voice. When he denied the charge again, the denial sounded rehearsed to ears already convinced. Truth does not survive when belief arrives first. The turning silence. There came a moment when no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone felt the same conclusion forming. It was a heavy silence, final, unquestioned. This was the moment when the trial stopped being a process and became a decision. The verdict without ceremony. There was no dramatic announcement, no raised voice. The magistrates spoke calmly, as if stating a necessary fact. John Billington was found guilty of murder. The words settled into the room slowly, like dust after collapse. Some nodded. Some looked away. No one protested. What comes after guilt? Even after the verdict, there was hesitation. Execution was not a small thing. This would be the first time the colony took a life as punishment for murder. They understood the weight of that act, but they also understood the message not doing so would send. That murder could be forgiven. That order was negotiable. That authority was weak. They could not allow that. The sentence. Death. Not spoken harshly. Not spoken with pleasure. Spoken as necessity. Billington was to be executed by hanging, publicly, so that no one would misunderstand what this new society stood for. Billington's reaction. He did not shout. He did not beg. He closed his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked up and said quietly that God knew the truth. Some took comfort in that. Others felt uneasy. Because if God knew the truth and they were wrong, then judgment would not end here. The colony prepares. Word spread quickly. This would not be a private act. The execution would be witnessed. Children would be kept away, but everyone else was expected to attend. Justice, they believed, needed to be seen. Fear, once unleashed, needed direction. The night before, Billington was held under watch. Not in chains. Not locked away like a monster. Just guarded. Men sat with him in shifts. Some spoke. Some prayed. He slept little. Outside, the colony lay awake with him, because tomorrow, something irreversible would happen. Justice or revenge. The day America learned how to kill in the name of law. Morning came without mercy. The sky was clear, almost indifferent, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge what was about to happen. Birds moved through the air freely. The wind passed through trees that had stood long before the colony and would stand long after it. Only the people felt the weight. This was not an ordinary day. This was the day the colony would decide who it truly was. The walk. John Billington was brought out slowly. No hood. No final speech announced. No ritual of forgiveness demanded. Just footsteps on hard ground. Each step echoed louder than it should have. The crowd had gathered early. Men stood with arms crossed. Women watched from a distance. Some faces were hard with certainty. Others tight with doubt. No one spoke, because words could no longer change anything. The gallows. The gallows were simple. Rough wood. Newly built. Untested. That alone unsettled people. This structure had never been used before. It did not yet carry history. Today it would receive it. The rope hung still. Someone adjusted it with care, as if precision could make the act cleaner. Nothing about this felt holy, and yet they told themselves it was necessary. The purpose of witnesses. This execution was meant to be seen. That was the point. Justice, as they understood it, required visibility. Fear required memory. They wanted everyone to know what happened to those who crossed the line. This was not only punishment, it was instruction. Billington's final moments. Billington stood beneath the gallows and looked out. He recognized faces, men he had worked beside, families he had known for years, people who had once trusted him. His voice when he spoke was calm. He said again that God knew the truth. He said nothing more. No confession, no plea, just that sentence. It hung in the air longer than the rope ever would. The moment it happened, there was no signal, no dramatic countdown. The executioner acted. And just like that, it was done. Some people looked away instantly. Others stared, frozen. A few felt relief. Many felt something they could not name, because witnessing death is different from imagining it. Silence afterward. No one cheered. No one spoke. The body remained there longer than necessary, partly because they believed it should, partly because no one knew what the correct next step was. This was the first time they had done this, and it showed. What they told themselves. They told themselves justice had been served. They told themselves order had been restored. They told themselves God would approve. And maybe in that moment some of them believed it, because belief was easier than doubt. What they did not say. No one said this out loud, but it moved through the crowd like a shadow. What if we were wrong? That question had no place here, because if they were wrong, then the foundation they were building was cracked from the start. So the question was buried, deep, the aftermath. Life resumed. Fields were worked. Meals were cooked. Prayers were said. But something had changed. The colony had crossed a line. They had proven they could kill one of their own and call it law. That knowledge did not fade. It settled. The birth of a system. This execution did not end violence. It organized it. From this moment forward, punishment would follow structure. Trials would evolve. Rules would be written. But at their core, they would carry the same truth. Law was born not from fairness, but from fear of chaos. A dangerous precedent. Future cases would look back at this moment. They would say, this is how it was done before. They would say, this is acceptable. The first murder trial became the template, not because it was perfect, but because it was first. And firsts carry authority whether they deserve it or not. Billington's legacy. John Billington did not disappear into history. His name became a warning. Reminder of what happens when a community decides certainty matters more than truth. Whether he was guilty or innocent no longer mattered. The system had spoken, and the system survived. What America inherited. This crime did not just end a life. It shaped a nation's relationship with justice, public punishment, moral judgment, faith mixed with law. These ideas would echo for centuries, in courtrooms, in prisons, in executions yet to come. The final truth. America's first murder did not teach the colonies how to stop killing. It taught them how to justify it. And that lesson would follow the nation far longer than any one crime ever could. The end. A man was killed. A system was born. And a country began its long struggle with justice. Not in freedom, not in equality, but in fear.